and welcome to our webinar. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones. It's good to be with you today. I'm sorry to be a couple minutes late. My computer just froze, so hopefully everything is up and running now. This is translation notes, Mark 15:6 through 15. We move to a new section today. This is Barabbas over Jesus. That's going to be the decision that Pilate makes based on some feedback, as we'll see. This will be part one of this passage. It spans 10 verses, and we should be able to get through the whole passage in two parts, with part one being today and part two being next time. Let me know if you're having any issues hearing me or seeing my screen or accessing the handout. The handout is available to you in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. I'm showing it on my screen here. You can also access it and all the other handouts from this series at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. I've also put my email address here, abramkj@accordancebible.com. So if you're watching this on a recording afterwards, you can feel free to get in touch with me that way, and you can also get the handout here. Just a little bit of background on this series. We use the app Accordance for the whole time, although it's not as focused on features within the app as some of our other webinars are. We have quite a few webinars for that. They are recorded and posted on our webinars section of the website, and I'll show you once I have Accordance open. If you just go to the help menu there, and webinars, you'll find all of the pre-recorded webinars. There's a lot there. So if you're interested in something more feature focused, that's the place to go. But today we are focused on translating the Greek text of Mark into English and answering the questions that come up around words and also combinations of words. So thinking about lexical features and also grammatical or questions of syntax that come up when we translate. We will start with Mark 15:6, just to set the stage here. This is Jesus before Pilate. We had seen that last week. I'll just open up a Bible translation here. This heading here, in fact, is Jesus before Pilate. So we see that we started in verse 1 of chapter 15 with the chief priests and the elders and the scribes or the law experts and the whole council, the whole Sanhedrin we saw. Led Jesus away to Pilate, and then from verse 3 onward, the primary actors that Mark names are the chief priests. So we'll see them. But they're before Pilate already. Jesus has answered Pilate the first time and has not answered Pilate the second time. So as we enter today's passage, we've got Pilate, we've got the chief priests, and we've got a silent Jesus. So here is verse 6. Kata de heortein apeluein autois henadesmian han paretunta. I'll go just left to right at first in accordance. According to or every feast or at the feast, he would release to them one of the prisoners or one prisoner. You actually just have the masculine singular accusative. So one prisoner, whomever they asked. I've translated it. Now at the feast, he would release to them one prisoner whom they requested. Or if that's a little wooden to you, he would release to them one prisoner of their choosing, or of their, I guess they're not choosing, they're asking, of their asking. Kata heortein is at the feast. We don't have this in accordance, and I haven't put this in the handout, but Rod Decker, in his handbook on the Greek text, notes that he calls this a distributive kata. So he translates it as at each celebration of the festival. And this comes across in English just fine with at the feast, especially with this he would. We'll look at this imperfect in just a moment. But the idea here is both with this kata, so every, and this imperfect here with apeluein, which here I think is showing habitual action. The idea here is this is a custom. This is a regular occurrence. What we're about to see is as expected, as is tradition. So I think the goal in translation is to make sure that that comes out. Now, this might be a little bit weak in bringing that out. Now, at the feast, he would release to them. That may be sufficient. You could compare translations. You could even say now at every feast, it was his custom to release to them. That's bringing it out a little bit more explicitly. Those are the kinds of decisions we're always making in translation. But the distributive kata with the imperfect apeluin from apoluo is showing that this was the custom, that Pilate would release to them one of the prisoners. Distributive is the kata here, which means it's almost like it distributes over every feast. In fact, you can find that particular grammatical category. I would start maybe with Wallace and search it by titles. Maybe not. That's going to be, oops, distributive. Yeah, that will be in there. In fact, you could even do, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can even do a search where you search distributive and kata. And here we go. That gets us right, well, it will get us there eventually. I won't take the time to do that. Here it is. Indicating the division of a greater whole into individual parts. All right, so the idea is that kata here is like each feast, every feast. So there are a number of ways, as you can see, to translate this. Again, the important thing, I think, is to bring out the fact that this is a habitual, customary action. And we're just getting background information here. Mark maybe he thinks the readers or listeners won't know this, or he just wants to bring it out. Certainly for us, who 2,000 years and several continents over, for those of us who may not know this custom, it's very helpful background information. So that's what is going on with the beginning here. We get this background information. It's interesting, this apeluin, the subject of it is not explicit in this verse. We're in a new passage, but remember, these passages and paragraphs and sentences, I mean, those are not in the original manuscript, so we don't want to get too atomistic. If we just scroll up to verse 5, Pilate is not very far away from this verb. So Pilate was amazed. Now, at every festival or at every feast, he would release, or he used to release, or it was his custom to release. So I think the third person singular imperfect verb has the subject of Pilate. It's certainly the closest referent. I mention this though because there are a few translations that take this as the what's called the impersonal third person. And if we have something like this in English, it's kind of like you know what they say. And then you fill in the blank with some kind of pithy aphorism or saying. And so if that's the understanding here, it would be, now at the festival, it was customary for a prisoner to be released to them, anyone whom they asked. And I don't remember now which translations, but there were a few translations that have that. However, I think the grammar justifies that. I think you can, oh, maybe I'm not finding any. I know I had found some before. Yeah, here we go, NIV. Now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner. Okay, so that says nothing about Pilate. I think that is perfectly justified by the grammar because the third person can work that way. However, I think Pilate, because he's right here in verse 5, and we wouldn't know this till we translate it all the way through, in verse 9, Pilate is saying, do you want me to release? So we get that same verb with Pilate explicitly. To me, it's pretty clear that we want Pilate here as the subject. So I just do he because Pilate was mentioned in verse 5. You don't really see that here at the beginning of this passage on its own. So if you were just kind of diving into this passage as we are today, maybe a better translation is, now at the feast, Pilate would release to them. But if you're reading this in sequence, Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival or feast, he used to release a prisoner. So I don't take this as the impersonal third person, even though the NIV does. Again, grammatically, totally justifiable, and that could be right, but I think this is talking about Pilate himself. He will come up again. So whom would he release? Hena desmion, one prisoner, and not just any one prisoner, but we get a modifying phrase, han paretunta. And the han here is in the accusative. That's why we get whom, not who. They requested him, not they requested he, so whom. But the han matches the on here in desmion, and it also matches the hena, which is an accusative. And you can see this visually pretty well in the diagram tool in verse 6. Desmion, hena, han, all of these are accusative. So it's not just any prisoner, but it's the one whom they asked for or whom they requested. That requested paretunta is also subjunctive, imperfect, middle indicative, third person plural. It's also subjunctive, which matches the apeluen in the subjunctive. It goes also with that repetitive, or as Decker says, distributive kata. It's the same kind of way of talking about it, and so it's just emphasizing, again, this was tradition. So here's the tradition. Every festival, Pilate would release to them one prisoner whom they requested. And if you want a little bit more background information, Mark is already giving us background information, but R.T. France notes in his commentary on this verse in Mark that this was not just any festal custom, not just any custom of any festival, it was the Passover in particular. And he cites John 18:39 for that. We don't even need to go outside of the Bible to get that background information. John 18:39 in the NRSV says, "But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" So it's really the same thing with the addition of at the Passover in John 18:39. We could look at that on our own. Again, this doesn't come into our translation of Mark because it's John, not Mark, but here we have ento Pascha. So instead of the more general word feast, we get Passover here. So that's some helpful background information if you want it, and I provide that here. But in translation, it would just be the feast or the festival. The UBS Translators Handbooks, I didn't note this in your handout, but they make the point that, in translation, maybe so as not to be confusing, think about this word feast, and maybe festival is better here because let me just find the UBS Translators Handbooks. It makes this great point that in your translation, you don't want to give the sense that this is happening at a meal per se. And maybe feast doesn't do that, but here's their note, and I thought this was great. At the feast must not be translated in such a way as to mean, there's a typo in there, that Pilate released a person at the place where the people were gathered together eating. It is better to treat this as a temporal reference at the time when the people feasted, or at that time when the people were feasting. So that's just a note to consider. Maybe that doesn't bother you to leave it as at the feast, but these are the kinds of questions to ask, is that yes, feast translates heortain just fine, but we want to think about how does this read in English? Is it faithful to how the Greek reads? Because sometimes when we move from one language to another, we can bring in unintended connotations. Now at the feast, he would release to them one prisoner whom they requested. So with that background in mind, we are prepared now to see what's going to happen. Barabbas is coming up next in verse 7. Let's pause first and see if you've got questions or comments on verse 6. The Decker resource, I'll put this in the chat, is called, it's the Baylor Handbook on the Greek Text. It's in 2 volumes. This is from volume 2, which is Mark 9 through 16. I'll put that in the chat. Excellent resource. I would love to have it in accordance. I have it in print though, and when I remember, which has been recently, every time I look at it before I finalize this handout, because he's got great insight. He himself was an avid accordance user before he passed a few years ago. What other questions or comments do you have? Let me check the questions box. Here's a comment. This will transition us perfectly to verse 7. Good example of uses of the imperfect tense. Verse 6 is iterative or customary versus durative in verse 7. Yeah, let's move to verse 7. Thanks for that. And that's the larger point there being, of course, that the imperfect has many possible nuances. I think I've mentioned before that if you want the longest list, go to Wallace, although any grammar, Robertson actually is a good, it's an older grammar, but it's got some good cataloging of the different uses of the imperfect. But in fact, here we go. Here's the iterative, customary imperfect. That's what we're looking at here. But you can see here, we'll just detour for about 30 seconds. I mean, this is gamma. So we've got doubtful imperfects, the descriptive tense and narrative. All right, so the iterative imperfect, the progressive imperfect, the conative imperfect, the negative, the potential. I mean, there's a lot of different nuances, and the way that you know is context. And even then, that alone doesn't always answer the question, which is why you've got multiple different translations available to you in accordance for that and other reasons. All right, verse 7. Let me get back in accordance to verse 7. Okay. Hen de ha legamenas Barabbas meta ton stasiaston dedemenas poitines en testase phanan pepoiekesan. And if we go left to right, we get now or and or but. There was the one called Barabbas with the insurrectionists imprisoned, who in the insurrection murder had committed. Now, we'll see this in more detail in just a moment, but maybe the most important thing about this verse to note is that we've got Barabbas introduced here as the one named, the one called Barabbas, and he was imprisoned with the insurrectionists. Again, we'll unpack all of this, but this hoitines means who, and then in the insurrection had committed murder. Now, here is a good example of where Greek is able to be precise in a way that English is not, because of how it inflects for case and number. So here we've got hoitines, which is masculine plural nominative. So the nominative case, ha legamenas is nominative case. So who committed murder? Well, if you just go by case, it could be Barabbas, but in fact it's plural. So that hoitines there, so the ones who had in the insurrection committed murder must go with something that's plural, and we do have a plural set of actors here, and that is the rebels or the insurrectionists. So they, in fact, are the ones who committed murder. That's not to try to exonerate Barabbas for anything. It's just to say that this verse is not saying that Barabbas committed murder, even though if you just go left to right, it looks like it. And if you miss this really important ending here, it can be kind of hard to follow because the word order here is not conventional for English. So you decide then whether my translation does that or not, and if you don't think it's clear enough, make sure it's clear in yours. I've translated it this way: and the one named Barabbas was imprisoned with the insurrectionists, who in the insurrection had committed murder. Maybe that who, I think in this sentence it's clear, but maybe that's still too ambiguous for you. So then you could bring it out with something like, and the one named Barabbas was imprisoned with the insurrectionists, comma, those who in the insurrection, or the ones who in the insurrection had committed murder. The ones who is actually a nice way to bring out the pluralness of the Greek who, which our English who doesn't do. So that's just a note. We want to make sure to make that clear. What's hard about this verse is that we have a construction in Greek that just does not exist in English. In fact, in English, we have a certain allergy to splitting up our verbs. You've heard of the split infinitive. So if you have an infinitive like to imprison, you do not, according to some conventions of style, you do not want to say to suddenly imprison or to not imprison. You would keep the to imprison together and the adverbs go either before or after. Well, here we have the periphrastic participle. So this is in fact another use of the imperfect. This ein here is the imperfect indicative. It's a form of a me. And in the periphrastic participle, you have a form of a me, so a being verb. Can be ginomai for becoming as well, with a participle, and it means was xing, or was something ing, and the participle gives you the ing. So the periphrastic participle here is ein dedemenas. And I've put that here in your handout. Now the challenge here is you get the ein here at the beginning of the verse, but then you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more words before you get the dedemenas. So if we don't, you can write a split infinitive and it will make sense in English, even if someone says stylistically it's wrong or not to be preferred. You can't even write a split periphrastic participle in English and have it make sense at all. So this does work in Greek, and the reason why, it's back to this hoitines here, the case endings, the inflections, it all makes it clear what goes with what. So you've got this ein, which is calling for a masculine singular nominative participle because it's the subject, and you know that it goes with this other participle ending in os and Barabbas, and you know that this does not go with ton, stasia, stone, because that's genitive. This is nominative. But ask questions if this is going too fast. But the idea here is that we have a Greek construction that just cannot be replicated in English, which is why we're talking about a translation and not just leaving it at an interlinear. So was imprisoned has to go together in English. Otherwise you've got, and the one named Barabbas, how would you even do that? And the one named Barabbas was with the insurrectionists imprisoned. I guess you could do that. I wouldn't though. So we put these together how they belong in English, and just note these intervening words here, I think for an English translator, make it a little confusing. It's just another reason why, and we don't really do this in these webinars, but when you're sitting down to translate a passage, before you get into the weeds and the clauses and the words, it's probably good to even just read the whole thing in Greek, especially the whole verse before you do the verse, to get a sense of the flow, to find where the verbs are, to find where this ein reaches its completion with this participle here. Barabbas is just introduced as ha legomenos Barabbas, the one or the man called or the one named Barabbas. And we could wonder about that. We could also research him more if we wanted to. You could right click and search for the lexeme. You could look it up in a dictionary and do some background research if you wanted to. How Mark introduces him is just as the one named Barabbas, and then gives us this information that he was imprisoned with the insurrectionists who in the insurrection had committed murder. Now, is this, we established already, Mark is not saying Barabbas was a murderer in that insurrection, but he was with the insurrectionists. And so we wonder, is there a sort of guilt by association? I think generally speaking, if you were to read this about a person, you would at least associate them with the murder, whether you thought they were implicit or not. So the overall effect is that, yeah, this guy is no angel. He's certainly no Jesus, even if he's not the one who committed murder. He was imprisoned with the insurrectionists, statiaston, and that's a participle serving as a noun. I'm sorry, it's not a participle. I take that back. It is just a noun, masculine plural genitive. So he's imprisoned with them. If you triple click this word, you can see here BDAG gives us a factious person, so one who causes factions, who causes public discord, rebel, revolutionary. Search further and you get from Low and Nida a person who engages in insurrection, an insurrectionist, a rebel. Brill's Dictionary of Ancient Greek gives us one who stirs up discord, insurrectionist, rebel. So you've got some different options here. However you translate it, I just advise that same root comes up again in the verse. So you've got stasia stone in this noun here, this genitive, and you've got ente stase here. So if this is the person who commits the thing, this stase is the thing. So with the same root at play, we just want to be consistent. So I've done that here with the insurrectionists who in the insurrection had committed murder. If you think rebel's a better translation, who was imprisoned with the rebels who in the rebellion had committed murder. I would just show that same root in English if you can. We could spend more time on this word. I think really what you'd want to do to research this more heavily, and I'll just kind of mention this as a future direction, is you would want to look at this word through any of your Greek sources and see where else it comes up. Going back to Rod Decker in his Baylor Greek Handbook, he notes that this word, and you could find this himself, he probably used accordance to find this. This word only occurs, he says, here in the New Testament and not at all in the Septuagint. And he goes on, it is quite common, however, in Josephus, more than 70 times. So this could be a great occasion to further research this word. And if you're doing that with the goal of translation in mind, maybe you hope to come to some kind of clarity here. But I also don't think that's strictly necessary to be able to translate it. You can also just compare your different translations and see how they render it. We've got insurrection, uprising. Interesting, the Common English Bible says locked up with the rebels who had committed murder during an uprising. They didn't keep that, they didn't preserve that root there in English. I've got a lot of insurrection. Here you've got rebels and rebellion, so that's a good example of preserving the root. Anyway, you would want to go to Josephus if you really wanted to look at this historically, and of course any of your commentaries may say more about this. What we don't know though, and what Mark doesn't really seem preoccupied with, is telling us which rebellion, how many people died, what exactly Barabbas's role is. He just presents this as something that is a contrast with Jesus. And he was associated again with these murderers, and certainly was involved in the insurrection. Technically, it doesn't say he was, it just says he was imprisoned with them. So I suppose that leaves room for an interpretation that he was falsely imprisoned or imprisoned under false pretenses, but I think that would strain credulity a little bit in terms of what Mark is after here. And this also would bear out if you research this further in the other parallel passages and according to other background sources. Let me just pause there for questions. Oh, first I'll note Pepoye Keisan is pluperfect, had committed. And so again, we're getting some background information here. Here's the note from, this is from the SIL Exegetical Summary Series. They just highlight how that pronominal adjective hoitines is plural. And they say the willingness of Pilate to release Barabbas suggests he was not the rebel who had actually committed the murder. And I suggest that theoretically, even if you could establish that, the grammar alone clarifies the issue. And so I noted this at the beginning. We just want to make sure our English translation doesn't leave room for people to read off of it that Barabbas himself was the murderer, because that's not what Mark is saying. All right, so that's verse 7. Let's stop and see questions or comments that you've got on this verse. Here's a comment. I'll put this in the chat. Meta toin stasiaston dedemenas hoitines. Plurality must be communicated. Who all or who were. That's a good way to do it. Yep. Yeah, that works really well actually, because even the had committed here could still be singular. So who all in the insurrection had committed murder, or who were committing murder, something like that. That's a great idea. So what, we don't have a plural who, but what are some other plural words we do have to bring this out? That's a great approach, I think, and just what we have to do sometimes. Again, I've said this many times before, and I've heard it from others many times before. Translating anything from any language to any other language, it's not like the decoder ring that you find in your cereal box and figure out one letter goes to another letter, because as we saw with the periphrastic participle, there are some things that one language does that another language just cannot do. And that's the beauty of the diversity of human language, I think, and one of the joys actually of getting to read something in another language. But that's a great example. So bring it out with the plural somehow there. Thanks for that comment. Let me see if there's any other questions or comments. Okay, here's a note on the word for murder, which we didn't really look at. Somebody says, phanos, murder is usually few, killing, slaughter is many more. Yeah, that's a good point. This does sound like a singular murder, how it's translated here. And so that would be something else to check. Murder, killing. Yeah, I would spend a little bit of time on that. We won't do it now, but that's a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's worth looking into. And even here we get the gloss of murder and slaughter. And there is a difference. I mean, not that, one is more justifiable than the other, that we're sort of rating human lives or anything like that. But I think the nuance may be important here. So I think looking at this, you could search with a lexeme and look at it across the New Testament and see what you get. You could look at your different lexicons other than BDAG and see what you get. I think what Mark is after here, just because he's vague-ish, I think what we've got here is, I mean, he's really talking about the act of murder, and it doesn't, to me, seem like he himself is specifying. Like, it's bad enough if it was just one murder, as Mark is putting it. But I think that does very much warrant further study, and that may change how you translate this word. Maybe, and I think you're right, slaughter does seem to imply more. And if that's what you end up reading off of this, then that's what you should bring out in translation. Let me just see what the UBS Translator's Handbook has, and then we'll move on to the next verse. Not much. They just have murder. Yeah. All right. Great comment. Let's move on to verse 8. So we've got the stage set, and now we actually get the narrative. I mean, it's all narrative, but we have this historical background of what was the custom, verse 6, and then we have a more recent background of what has just happened to bring Barabbas to us. And now, verse 8, kai anabat ha'aklas ersata aitestai kathos epoye autois. Let's go left to right. And coming up, participle, the crowd began to ask. So arco is looking for a complementary infinitive. So began to infinitive, there it is. It complements it or completes it. Began to ask, just as he was in the habit of doing for them. So that's what the Greek is saying. That doesn't work very well for a final translation. Here's what I came up with. Then the crowd came up and began to ask him to do for them what he usually did. I will be the first to admit, this is a lot of English words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, for 3 Greek words. And that's okay. I mean, maybe not ideal. Again, you cannot be one-to-one. Sometimes you can. I like to try to be. I think it's more elegant that way, but there's probably a more economical way to translate this. But the idea here is that they asked kathos epoie autois. What did the crowd ask? They asked just as he would do for them. So you, because of this habitual or this iterative poieo, like we had in verse 6, following the imperfects, we need more than just he did, I think. I think we need something like what he customarily did, what he usually did, what he was in the habit of doing, however you want to bring that out, how he would do for them. And the kathos is just as. What's missing in this phrase, though, is a verb. And so in English, they're asking, begin to ask for them what he usually did. Ask him to do for them what he usually did, right? So we need something here that just makes this make more sense in English. In the NIV, the way they've done this is the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. This is where I like the NASB because it will show you, as you know, in italics, what is not explicitly in Greek. So maybe this is distracting to you if you're just reading the NASB straight through. Maybe you like it, but it's regardless, it's really good for translation because you can see the crowd went up and began asking him to do. So that poieo that is not there. This accustomed to do, that's that poieo. But you in English, I mean, if you were backward translating this, if Greek functioned exactly as English, you would have another poieo in here. But Greek, as we've seen, it's easier for it to leave words out, like a direct object, or in this case, a verb, and for it to still make sense in Greek in a way that it doesn't in English. NASB gives us a good sense of that here. This anabas ersata, I'm reading as a participle of attendant circumstance. We've seen that often. It's where you've got, usually in the aorist, a participle and another aorist indicative verb. The more literal or wooden translation would be approaching him or coming up to him, comma, the crowd began to ask. There's no reason you couldn't translate it that way unless you thought it was bulky or cumbersome. A lot of translations just take this as two actions like on the same line of the diagram, even though they're not grammatically. But the idea is that logically they're coming up and asking him. And even this, really, this is just one action. It's like the example that I often use of it's all right, it's time to get up and go. Yeah, you do have to get up before you go. You probably would only say that to someone who's sitting down or laying down, but it's really the same action. Like we need to leave. So you could think about if you wanted to use one verb for that, because it's really the same action. But I think with the two Greek verbs here, I think this works just fine in English. Then the crowd came up and began to ask him to do what he usually did for them. Autois. So somehow to render that this is for them, on their behalf, for their sake, that they're asking him to do his usual custom. And now it doesn't say what that is in verse 8, but we know from verse 6 that what he usually did was he would release a prisoner. So without saying he's asking for them to release a prisoner explicitly, Mark is saying they're just asking him to do what he usually did. So in that sense, there's nothing unusual about this scene, except that Jesus happens to be on the other side of this decision. So Mark will bring that out. Any questions or comments on verse 8? Pilate responds, Hade Pilatas apekrithe autois legon thelete apoluso humin ton basileia ton Judaion. But Pilate answered them, saying, do you wish or do you want me to release, or do you want that I should release, subjunctive there, to you the King of the Jews? So release to you, that's in the dative case, just like the autois do for them, for their sake. And then ton gives us this whole phrase in the accusative because it is the object of the release. It is the person that is, or that could be on the receiving side of the release. Jesus, of course, he's not, but he's asking, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? It's interesting that he doesn't even say the one called the King of the Jews. He just says the King of the Jews. Let's unpack this verse just a little bit. Pekrithea tois legon, as we go left to right, it's answered them saying, I've pointed this construction out before. Mark uses it a lot. The legon you could think of, I mean, you could translate it this way. King James will do that, but you could also just treat this as a quotation mark. I think, and Pilate answered them is just fine. In fact, I saw that in a number of translations. I went with responded to them because to me, and this might just be me, but to me, it felt a little funny for him to answer them and then have a question mark. Usually I would think of an answer as having a declarative statement, not an interrogative one. Now I know that's not always the case, so maybe it's just fine, but to me, that was how I wanted to translate this apekrise, which you can do anyway. I think you'll see that as a gloss. Answer, reply, respond. So he's responding to them. He replied to them, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? I notice the subjunctive here, this apoluso, it's a theoretical. Do you want me to do this? I haven't yet. I could not. What do you want? And then again, this title, the King of the Jews. This would be worth some time on. Right click once you've selected the phrase, search for the lexeme, and we can just jump ahead to Mark. Comes up a few times in this chapter, 4 times. In fact, it's the only chapter it comes up in Mark. We looked at this last time because it was in verse 2. This is not exactly a preferred title for Jesus in Mark. It's Pilate himself who introduces it. Su e habasileus ton Judaion. Are you the King of the Jews? And we see here that Jesus answered him saying, you say so. And we spent some time last week thinking through what sort of tone might be implied there, or whether, in what way Jesus is saying that, as we saw, is a question of interpretation. But that's where we had it before. It was from Pilate. And in verse 12, just looking ahead, Pilate again answered, saying to them, what therefore do you want me to do? Here we get a textual issue with the one called, that'll be fun to unpack, but just the King of the Jews. So it's Pilate again, and then here we get the epigraph written above him, the King of the Jews. So nowhere has Jesus explicitly used this of himself. We've got this response to Pilate, which we talked about, but it's that same title of Pilate. And they seem to recognize it because I guess they were there for verse 2. So that's the title. This would be a good thing to say, all right, I've done my translation, I'm moving on. And if you've got the time and the means, maybe to research this a little bit and think about, what is this doing rhetorically that Pilate is calling him the King of the Jews? What does this reveal to us about Pilate's understanding about Jesus? And I think looking at the commentaries could be really productive for that. But for translation, pretty straightforward. And Pilate responded to them, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? Any comments or questions about verse 9? This is interesting. We haven't really been looking at these datives, but I think it is worth asking because they come up so much. Release to you or for you. This here is saying in accordance with their request. So I think that's interesting. You could spend some time thinking about exactly what that dative means. Here's a good comment. Somebody says the King of the Jews seems seated. Info to Pilate beginning at verse 2 from the Jewish leaders. Let's go back there. Just open up a parallel here. A question, are you the king of the Jews? Yeah, it's interesting. We don't really, Mark doesn't tell us where this comes from. That is a logical explanation. Are you the king of the Jews? In other words, we could read this as, are you the king of the Jews, whom this group has just introduced you as, or whom I got word you were coming to me? But in Mark, it's just on Pilate's lips without explanation of where it comes from, although it certainly could have been, as you say, ceded to him from them. But this is from Pilate. So yeah, I think this is worth it, and also an examination of the parallel passages here, because it's, and the reason I make a big deal out of this is the king of the Jews. I mean, that's a pretty well-known phrase in circles with, you know, some degree of biblical awareness, and so the title has stuck, whatever Pilate understood or didn't understand about Jesus. And whatever works or doesn't work about this title for Jesus. I mean, you might even think about what does that mean theologically today. But this is Pilate's go-to, and we get it again here in verse 9. Verse 10 gives us some more background information. Mark is gracious to do so in this passage. Let me close these other windows or other panes. Eginosken gar hatidia thanan paradedokesan autan hoi archieres. For he knew that on account of envy or jealousy, they had betrayed him. And then here's the subject. On account of envy or jealousy, the chief priests had handed him over, betrayed him, delivered him over. This could mean betray. And it was used of Judas, was it not? But in this case, I think the simpler handed over suffices. That's maybe something to look deeper at if you want. Here's how I've rendered it here. For he knew that it was on account of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. Now, I followed the NET by putting parentheses around these verses. You don't have to, but either way, it's background information. And in this case, the imperfect here, you could say for he had known if you wanted to, or he was knowing, but I think here the imperfect is serving a discourse function, for lack of a better word, and highlighting that this information is background to the narrative. So it's not part of this narrative per se. In other words, Mark is not in the middle of the story of the envy that the chief priests had for Jesus. He's bringing that in from the background somewhere. Now, from the background somewhere, we've got 14 chapters already, and Strauss here brings this out. I won't read this now, but I just put this comment here from Strauss in his commentary that it summarizes well, envy does, the confrontation between Jesus and the religious leaders, and he put some references here. So we could go back, even if we don't find that word per se, maybe the first thing is to say, well, is there a time in Mark where it said that the leaders were jealous of Jesus? Well, not with that exact word, but Strauss points the way to some passages we can look at. So this is all background. He knew, and that's what I use the parentheses for, although you don't have to. Paradedokesan, if that parsing gave you some trouble, and maybe it didn't because of these instant details, but that's pluperfect. That is the had delivered. That's kind of in keeping with how the imperfect backgrounds this stuff here. He knew that it was on account of envy that they had handed him over. We looked last time at the chief priests. It was not just the chief priests that began all of this. We had, as you may recall from last time, the chief priests, yes, with the elders and the law experts and all the Sanhedrin. I noted though, well, we noted together that by verse 3, it's just the chief priests. And I think it was France who had suggested that was deliberate. I think it's at least theoretically possible that it's still all of them, and Mark is just using this as shorthand. But maybe the simpler explanation is if Mark is saying the chief priests, we're just looking at the chief priests, and Mark is just saying the chief priests. So that's what I bring out in translation. even if you can make the case that it was a whole group that handed him over. Well, Mark is naming the chief priests specifically, and that goes all the way back to verse 3. That's not new in verse 10. It's not new in this passage. You've got the chief priests in verse 3, and then you've got them again. Well, I guess that's, yeah, you've got them again here. In fact, you could even look up the chief priests by right-clicking. Let me just do this, search for Lexeme, jump ahead to Mark. They're all through 14. Yeah, so here they are. They're part of the group in verse 1. They're kind of separated out in verse 3. Now here they are again as the primary actors that are named in verse 10. Let me get back to that on my handout. It's interesting too. Mark puts hoi archieres at the end of the sentence, which is one reason, again, I suggest, yes, at some point in translation, we're kind of thinking left to right, going a word, a clause at a time, but good to read the whole thing all the way through. You don't get this subject of this verb until the end. So it's interesting that it's at the end of the sentence, or even the end of the clause here. One wonders if that's for emphasis. One wonders if that's because Mark wanted to focus our attention on the hati diaphthanon. In other words, Greek is perfectly content to say, just like in English, hoi archieres para de do kesan auton diaphthanon. The chief priests handed him over because of envy. Pardon me a second. Mark does not do that. It's always good to ask why. We don't know for sure. I wonder here, though, if he's fronting because of the envy to focus on the motivation. And then we get the subject at the end. This would be very difficult to pull off in English, namely the chief priest at the end, but I do want to preserve that fronting if at all possible, and I think it's possible. So even if it makes more logical sense or sounds better to me to say he knew that the chief priest had handed him over on account of envy, that's fine, but Mark has fronted this. He's put our focus on that. So if I can at all do that in English, I will. So I have, for he knew that it was on account of envy that the chief priest had handed him over. That might sound a little more cumbersome. It might not read quite as smoothly, but as a translator, I want to bring out that envy if I can and get the reader to pay attention to it. And again, you're kind of left with your historical, or not historical, but your literary background of all of Mark at this point. Maybe you have to go back. This is a good starting point here. That word itself is not there, but you could certainly keyword search the chief priests. You could even do something like the chief priests within, I don't know, 15 words of Jesus, and let that take you to the passages where they're close by. That may not give you a whole lot. Maybe that's not the way to do it, but somehow going back to look at this would be useful. It may be too that Mark hasn't explicitly talked in terms of envy. You have to do something like what Strauss does here and talk about how popular Jesus is and how that maybe upset them or whatever it is. Again, none of this needs to go into translation, but Mark is giving us background information, so it is a good opportunity for us to go back and to see, okay, where has Mark already shared about this, if he has. So it was on account of envy that the chief priest handed him over. And Pilate knows that. Eginosken, he knows that. How does Mark know what Pilate knows? Well, that's a great question. And there are probably some great answers to it. But either way, we get an inside look into the scene, not just with the background, but actual like looking inside the character's mind, which I think is great. It just brings us right there. All right, we'll wrap up with verse 11 in just a moment. If you've got questions or comments, especially if you haven't asked anything so far, I will focus on those questions first, but I will answer all questions and comments. Yeah, here's a comment. I'll put this in the chat. Somebody says all the Sanhedrin could be a threat to Pilate, so maybe a representative group, that is the chief priest, came before Pilate. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Here's a question, I'll put this in the chat too. Is it conceivable that the chief priest would hand over a capital offense prisoner, Jesus, without instructions or seating information? And here he also discerns the envy motive. That's a great question. Right, so the idea being, how, yeah, so the question is, so I have the question, how does Mark know what Pilate knows? But maybe the more immediate question is, how does Pilate know this? And the question you're asking there suggests as one possibility that he knows this because there's more interaction here than just what we get. Or he could see it from them, or they said something that made their envy explicit that Mark hasn't recorded. Yeah, that's a great question. All right, let's wrap up with verse 11. I'm just mindful that we're almost at the end of the hour. Hoi de archieres, anesesan, tan aklan, hinamalan, tan baraban, apoluse autois. Again, this dative, to them, for them. There's a lot of that here. But, or and, the chief priests riled up, stirred up the crowd in order that instead Barabbas he might release to them. He, of course, being Pilate. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd so that instead he would release Barabbas to them. I kept instead the malon where it is in Greek. If that feels bulky to you, put it at the end. I did notice this one thing, and we'll just close with this because I thought this was really interesting. The last verse, verse 10, ends with chief priests. Even though they're the subject of that clause, they come last in the verse. And the beginning of this verse is the chief priest. So if you're reading this, it just creates an interesting effect. And I'm not sure whether to read anything off of this or not. But it was interesting to me how Mark's decision to end a phrase with this and then begin the next one gives you hoi archia res, hoi de archia res. It's got this poetic, repetitive feel to it, and you can draw a conclusion from that or not, but it is there in the Greek. I think it's interesting. This is maybe a reason to set your text pane display at some point at least to not just verses, but paragraphs. And you'll see it here. So we've got the chief priests, the chief priests. And that, there's no way that I know of to bring this out in English. So again, this is just maybe a plug for what we're doing, which is to look at it in Greek. We'll see things that are not in English translations that may not even be possible to bring out. It's sort of like, how do you translate rhyming poetry from one language to another? So whether you make anything of this or not, I thought it was interesting. So just highlight that. It is the chief priests who rile up the crowd so that he would release Barabbas to them. That's what's going to happen next, but we're going to stop there for today, and we will pick up next time. Let me see if you have any comments or questions as we come to a close. Let me just say too, again, the handout, tinyurl.com/Mark translation notes. You can find this handout and all the others in this series here. abramkj@accordancebible.com is my email address where you can reach me.